Thank you very much. And having just come from a meeting of the European Parliament, at the European Parliament in Brussels, perhaps I can cast a bit of light on the question you just posed. I have listened today to what has been mainly a discussion in illuminating detail of internal political and economic matters, of what Greece should and should not do. But it's not difficult for an outsider to see that in a larger sense, Greece is effectively powerless in the present situation, in the sense that what will be done is dictated and constrained from outside the country, and that policies imposed from the outside have so far always been posed against alternatives that appear to be worse. The situation, it seems to me, has several distinctive features. First, it does not exclude the belief of some, at some points in the past, that the policies might work, that they might have been in the interest of an economic recovery. It doesn't exclude the possibility that at some point, some actors inside Greece could come to identify with the outside forces. This is something that in psychology is referred to as the Stockholm Syndrome, in which the captives and hostages come to believe that those holding them are acting in their own best interest. But the time for that, it seems to be clear from the fact of this meeting and from the conditions that have been discussed today, is clearly finished. Clearly finished. Second, while internal reforms may be valuable, and some are certainly necessary, and many urgent measures have in fact been discussed today, for their own sake, constructive and effective for their own sake, no reform of any type can or will bring back the past in which this country had open access to the markets for credit from the private sector. Those markets have failed. They failed 5 years ago, and there is a simple reason why their performance and access to them is disconnected from what will happen here, is that investors do not judge Greece separately. Their principal focus is on risky sovereign assets as a class, or for that matter, risky assets in general as a class, and the degree of risk that they perceive does not depend on anything that happens here. So in the sense that implementing an aggressive program of change is not going to bring market access, defying an imposed program of change is not going to make things materially worse from the market's point of view. What happens outside in the world will determine those conditions. Third, some of the policy measures that have been presented to Greece as imperative necessities under the guise of the reform are plainly not reform at all. They are rather predatory or punitive. And in either case, they are driven by the politics of the leading creditor country without reference to events, circumstances, or prospects here. Fire sale privatizations, peremptory wage cuts, extraordinary debt covenants are of this type. And I think no authentically democratic government would accept such measures except under coercion. In which case, it seems to me, that they come under the general rubric of illegitimate obligations, very similar to odious debts for that reason. Fourth, as 5 years of falling output and employment make clear, with no end in sight, the reduction of Greece to its present condition, essentially of penury, is not a compelling problem for Europe so far. Nor, for that matter, is the rising debt burden that results from falling output. And it cannot be avoided when output falls as rapidly as it has been doing. This is obvious from the facts that each year of decline is met not by a change of policy, not by an urgent reconsideration of what is been proposed, but rather by two dishonest adjustments. One is a resetting of forecasts so that the growth that was expected for last year is now expected to start 6 months from now in the next year. Right? And you're familiar with this. And the other is the dishonest claim that the policies which have been demanded have not been implemented with sufficient zeal. Okay? As I said at the European Parliament 2 days ago, real change in these situations will come only when the north of Europe realizes that things cannot continue. And at that point, Germany in particular must decide whether to save the Eurozone with a policy of solidarity and mutual support, or to follow what is an emerging political tendency led by some of its own reactionary radicals, which is to effectively break the Eurozone in two. In the optimistic scenario, under which reasonable people decide that the European project is in fact worth rescuing, the technical means, I think, for doing so are already known to us. They have been expressed, for example, in the modest proposal of Yanis Varoufakis and Stuart Holland, a program which would prevail would have to include, at the least, the mutualization of debts. And interestingly, I raised this question with the French finance minister in the public forum at the European Parliament 2 days ago, Pierre Moscovici, and he responded that he was favorable to this idea, at least in principle, but at the end of an orderly process, not as the beginning step. And I thought, well, that was not certainly an unequivocal commitment, it was a very interesting answer, and one which moved the question from being one of an issue of principle to being an issue of timing. So I said afterwards, okay, if you want 6 years, I'll offer 6 months, and then we can just talk about how quickly this gets done. But in any event, it seems to me that there is a growing recognition that relieving the burden of debt, mutualizing it, so that every country which has been crushed by the burden of debt and the interest on that debt has a reasonable chance, breathing space within which to restructure and advance, is increasingly a consensus part of an alternative strategy. Second piece would be the restructuring of the banking system so as to divorce, so far as possible, the politics of individual countries from the direct interest of those national banks. And the third, much talked about, an investment program that it would effectively act as the core of a recovery program for the countries like Greece in particular, the countries of southern and peripheral Europe in general, to begin to rebuild their economies for a new era. And I would strongly endorse the idea that this would have to be done with a view toward the ecological constraints that we all face. To those three elements, I would add one more, which is coming under discussion, I think, and very usefully supported by trade unions in Northern Europe, including in Germany, which is the discussion of a Europeanization of social insurance. In particular, there is discussion of a comprehensive unemployment insurance program. I think it would be usefully extended to the area of pensions. The question of minimum wages is being raised. And things could be extended to education and health in ways that would give the citizens of Europe a direct sense of the benefit of belonging to a union and a stable flow of incomes that would make the deficit countries of Europe sustainable in a way that they are not. This is, in a sense, these are the elements of a policy of solidarity, which seems to me to be, from a European standpoint, the practical alternative to a descent toward fascism and violence. What is needed here now is more than a few adjustments of policy. What is needed is a comprehensive program capable not only of setting a new course, but of appearing to set a new course, of turning the psychological climate from the present one, which is heading toward social collapse and the destruction of the European project, to something which puts it on a profoundly more positive and hopeful path. So what is the task for Greece? Far be it from me to give you instructions on that point. But it seems to me that there are a few things that flow from what I've just said, and I will end by mentioning them. It seems to me that there are three things that people of goodwill here can usefully do. And they form a strategy that is of a kind with the timeless strategies of the powerless faced with remorseless exercisers of power. This is always a moral question, and it is something which has to be posed in terms of a moral fight. And the first thing, it seems to me, is to join across as wide a political spectrum as possible to give voice in detail and with passion and conviction to those who are weak and vulnerable and who have been hit the hardest by the events of the last 5 years and by the brutal reinforcement of those events by wrong-headed and vindictive policies. To articulate the demand for change and at the same time both an internal and an external program. That is to say, giving a clear sense of direction to this country's population, but also support to the very rapidly growing and very powerful rebellions that we are seeing in the sister countries of Southern Europe, who are in a similar position but not so far down the path. In particular, Spain and Italy, where one has to say, of course, one of the great encouraging moments was the elections a week ago, in which a population which was widely expected in Brussels to reaffirm the path of austerity and compliance, plainly rose up and said it would not do so. So it is not as though the people of Greece should feel that they don't have allies in the present environment, because you do. Second, to accelerate the process of change in European strategy by, let's call it, a targeted rejection of the most egregious and unjustifiable coercions. Taking a firm stand on a few issues can lead to a few victories. And a few victories can do much to restore self-respect and some hope for the capacity of democratic government going forward. I don't think we should underestimate this factor, even if they are small and symbolic. It is necessary to show that the spirit of sovereign self-government has not been wiped out and entirely handed over to committees directed by bankers. And third, to prepare carefully for negotiations to come, assessing priorities, options, and alternatives, so that when the time does come, there will be a determined government with a united public behind it, with its objectives clearly understood, making its case in unmistakable terms to what I think will be an increasingly sympathetic audience in the wider world. That's what I have to say. Thank you very much. I'll close. With just one phrase, adapted from William of Orange, who said, "It is not necessary to hope in order to persevere." Thank you again.